Hello, it's Concord Wind. Just woke up from a nap. I need to trim my beard. I've got a trimmer now. Well, I guess it's fine. Just pat it down a little bit. All right, whatever. Just got up from a nap. Had 3 shots of coffee, and before my nap, like this morning, I had 4 shots of coffee, and so I'm like drinking way too much caffeine a day. I preach a sermon on moderation. Uh, I'm struggling to hold on to that principle um, when it comes to caffeine. When it comes to food, like I eat in moderation. I eat small meals, but when it comes to caffeine, I build a tolerance to it, and then I need more, and it's really hard. um, Still haven't made my grocery list. Anyways, since we talked about Peter in the last episode, um, I found a passage that talks about Peter, and we'll read it. But hold on. Okay, I'm back. Sorry, I had to throw up because it just hit me out of nowhere. Just kind of like using the bathroom, like that hits me out of nowhere, and it's because the last shot of coffee I had, I put a little bit too much hot water, so there's too much liquids hitting my stomach at once. I guess is the reason. I mean, I always try to find explanations for things, but um, anyways, let's read this passage. God says, Peter was faithful to me for many years, yet he never grumbled nor had any complaint. Even Job was not his equal, and throughout the ages the saints have fallen far short of Peter. He not only sought to know me, but also came to know me during a time when Satan was enacting its deceitful schemes. This led Peter to serve me for many years, always in line with my will, and for this reason he was never exploited by Satan. Peter drew lessons from the faith of Job, yet also clearly perceived Job's shortcomings. Although Job had been of great faith, he lacked knowledge of matters in the spiritual realm, so he said many words that did not correspond to reality. This shows that Job's knowledge was shallow and incapable of perfection. Therefore, Peter focused always on gaining a sense of the Spirit, and always paid attention to observing the dynamics of the spiritual realm. As a result, he not only was able to ascertain something of my wishes, but also had a modicum of knowledge of the deceitful schemes of Satan. Because of this, his knowledge of me grew to be greater than anyone else's throughout the ages. Amen. So Peter is the example for us to follow, along with Job, because Peter followed in Job's footsteps and surpassed Job. Peter reached a level that was higher than Job, although Job was saved and Job was called perfect by God, though his knowledge was not perfect. Everything else about him was perfect. And Peter reached the greatest knowledge of God an ordinary man has ever reached in this world. And there might be like exceptions to that, since we live in the age of kingdom and people have access to millions of God's words, on their phones and in books, and so people might be able to reach people can definitely reach the level of Peter, and people might even be able to surpass Peter. My problem with my knowledge of God is that most of my knowledge of God is what I feel in my heart. And it's very hard for me to put into words the knowledge of God I've gained over the years. It's very hard for me to put it all into words. I know how God has treated me. And, you know, um, looking back at when I was younger, I if I were to only look at my younger self, okay, and judge my younger self and be like, okay, so people are saying that based on who I was when I was younger, like I was going to be chosen by God to some degree, you know, and like I wouldn't believe it, you know, because when I was younger, you know, I listened to death metal, it's like satanic death metal, and I listened to like gangster rap, and you know, I stole and I chased women, slept around with lots of women, and I would see different women at the same time, and they didn't know about each other. So I was going behind each woman's back to see the next woman, and I was seeing a bunch of women at the same time, and it's disgusting. And I ended up getting HPV. But the last time I got tested for STDs at the hospital, I didn't have HPV, so I don't know how that happened. I thought once you had HPV, you had it for life, but I tested negative for HPV, I think twice, or maybe it was only once. But you know, that's really weird that I would test negative for HPV when I was tested positive for it before. Well, technically, I didn't test positive for it. A girl I was sleeping with tested positive for it. You know, HPV is super contagious. You can get it just from shaking somebody's hand. Most of the world has it. And the fact that she tested positive with it and I didn't just shake her hand, I slept with her, like that means I pretty much had it, you know? And the fact that years later I tested negative for it is really weird. Like, I don't know how that happened. Anyways, maybe it was by the grace of God. Although HPV isn't really that dangerous, but maybe God just didn't want me to have it for some reason. It can develop into ovarian cancer in women, but of course I wouldn't have to worry about that, so I don't know. Anyways, you know, when I was younger, I would lie to everyone, and I would never hold myself accountable to my actions, and you know, I would do things that violated uh, normal humanity. You know, like I would cause disruptions in class and in the workplace. You know, and I was the class clown. So, I mean, I know that's not the worst thing, but I mean, sleeping around with women and doing drugs and drinking alcohol, which that's behavioral. But chasing women was dispositional because in my nature, I loved women more than anything, and that developed and evolved by way of my conscience and reason, and um, my nature. It didn't change. It evolved. You know, like into a form where I thought I need to find a woman to get married to and to stay committed and loyal to her and love her, and I thought, well, that, you know, that sounds good. You know, that's much better than sleeping around with a bunch of different women. But I was still idolizing women and putting them on a pedestal and worshiping them and putting them in a higher position than God. You know, finding a wife was number one. And prior to finding a wife, when I was just sleeping around with women, like sleeping around with as many women as I possibly could was my number one priority. That and drugs and alcohol. um, but even back then, I still had a principle of, when it came to drugs, for example, my principle was I'll only do drugs that are natural. Um, that was my principle. But of course, natural doesn't mean better. I've talked about this before. I think there's a time and a place for drugs, like in a hospital, or I think, if people are dealing with depression, they can go to a controlled environment. Maybe like, I don't know, and people who are suicidal and stuff, like, they go to a psych ward. There can be like an outdoor environment, a controlled environment, a place where they can't run away or use anything to harm themselves, and they can be given shrooms. I think as long as um, you know they are, of course, tested. Like, they're, I'm not sure how they accomplish this, but I know, like, doctors were able to see the diabetes runs in my mom's family. They were like, "Oh, does diabetes run in your family?" And they were able to tell that from like blood work or something. And she didn't have high blood sugar. They were just able to see, like, in her, that she had the gene. They were able to see that somehow. I don't know how they did that. It seems like they'd have to like look at the DNA to see that, but somehow they saw that. And so they'd have to look at, I'm not sure if this is even possible. Um, but they'd have to find out if there's a history of mental illness in patients prior to giving them shrooms, or at least have antipsychotics on hand, because I've heard that if you take shrooms and it puts you in psychosis, the moment you take an antipsychotic, it's like it's gone. You're out of the psychosis. That I've always heard that. So, well, not always, but recently I've heard that. And see, I'm trying to be honest, because my memory fails me, and when I say something, I'm like, oh, wait, like alarms start going off. I'm like, that's not honest, and then I have to correct that. So practicing honesty is very important. Peter was very honest, but I wouldn't have thought. When I was younger, I used to think I would have a story like Job, and sure enough, I did. So I don't know why God didn't. I don't know why God didn't go against my notions. In a way, He did, because I wasn't expecting to develop schizophrenia. What I thought. I thought the suffering I had to endure, um, you know, being like expelled from school and going to a private school where we were all us kids were abused, and in some classes, or in one class, Miss Susan's class, we couldn't talk. And if Miss Susan was the guardian at lunchtime, when we went to the cafeteria in the residential house on the property of the school, if Miss Susan was like the guardian there, we couldn't talk at lunchtime. And that made time go by so slow, because we didn't have work to do, we didn't have books to read, we just had to sit there. And I don't know what she was trying to accomplish by making us just sit there in silence and stare at the wall. I don't know what she was trying to accomplish. It's very sick. It's torture. She was torturing kids by making us just sit there in silence, staring at the wall. And I mean, like I would fall asleep and she would make me stand up. She wouldn't let me even sleep. It was messed up. And then I get to the next class, and the science teacher, he was so nice. He'd let us talk, sleep, whatever we wanted. And it was, but there for a while, we didn't have more than one class at that school. When I first started going there, we just had Miss Susan's class. So there was no breaks. You just had to sit there in silence for 8 hours a day or whatever. And I mean, that was really rough, And I thought, okay, I've suffered enough with this. I don't know what my neighbors are doing upstairs. Anyways, I've suffered enough with this. This is my Job story. I'm going to be paid back, and I'm going to be very wealthy when I grow older because of the suffering I've had to endure when I was younger. And I wasn't thinking, like, I didn't allow that suffering to bring me closer to God. I didn't have the knowledge necessary to do that. At that age, I didn't really have much of a relationship with God, It wasn't until I hit my early 20s I started to draw closer to God. And when I was younger, I mean, I was a mess, I was a terrible kid. I drove my parents absolutely crazy, and I didn't have any respect I didn't have any respect for my mother, but I had respect. I guess more just fear. I was afraid of my father, my dad. And of course, as I've gotten older, I've learned to respect my whole family, but I just respect people in general. I mean, there's exceptions, of course, but for the most part, I respect people. And I don't think respect is earned. I don't believe in that. I think if you're a normal person, even if you're corrupt, aren't you just like everybody else? Like, and God has done something very different with me. And I got this 5-leaf clover, and that represents how I'm reincarnated from a demon. I love this hat because it's a reminder of that, and it deeply humbles me to know that my origins reveal something about myself that is very humbling, which is that, I'm actually lower. Like, if ordinary corrupt humans are like right here, I'm like right here. I'm lower than an ordinary corrupt human. And that's very humbling. And it's a special situation because I've been lifted up and I've been chosen. I'm kind of an underdog, and my channel is very small, and I don't have much influence, and I am an underdog. Because, like my friend Maria told me, I've been dealt a bad hand in this life. And I really have, and God did that intentionally. He gave me a bad hand on purpose. And Satan is using it to try to make me give up and believe in science. And, what's silly, what Satan doesn't understand, is that God's principles are deeply ingrained in my heart, and it's changed who I am as a person. So even if I stopped believing in God, I would still be who I am. Like my belief in God isn't what's holding me together. I'm a changed person, and I'm a new person, and there's nothing that can bring me back to who I used to be. Like, because it's kind of like because like Whitechapel, I don't know if you guys have heard of Whitechapel. It's a satanic deathcore band I used to listen to back in the day, and they had an album called Recorrupted. And so the fact that's even a term makes me think there's people who think, oh, you could be recorrupted, and it's kind of like when a caterpillar changes into a butterfly. A butterfly can't change into a caterpillar. That's not how that works. Once it's a butterfly, it's a butterfly till the day it dies. And that's how I feel. I just feel that I know too much. I've seen through too much. I'm aware of too much. And it's too late. I'll be who I am right now in this moment. I'll be who I am right now in this moment till the day I die. Whether I believe in God or not, which of course I'll believe in God, because God is the reason I am who I am. But yeah, there's no turning back. I may improve, I may grow in wisdom, but as far as my ideology and my principles and my nature, I can still experience refinement, but my disposition is changed, and my disposition is compatible with God. And my disposition is not compatible with God because of Jesus' sacrifice. My disposition is compatible with God because of the work God has done on me to transform my disposition from a corrupt disposition to a, comparatively righteous disposition. A disposition that yearns for the truth, that loves the truth, that seeks the truth, that pursues the truth, that practices the truth, that pursues the truth. A disposition that is in line with the truth. And yes, I have my flaws. I've talked about that. I talk about that in almost every single video. I know you guys are sick of hearing about it. But those flaws are not related to disposition. One of my flaws is related to, it's just a habit that's, addictive. It's a habit that's addictive, and I'm addicted, and that's not related to disposition. And then the other flaw that I have is, somewhat related to, very, very related, actually. It's very much connected to that instinct to reproduce, which, the instinct for reproduction is our sex drive, which, is the motivation behind, desire, behind lust. When I say desire, I specifically mean lust. And that's a natural phenomenon. It's not like I'm married. I'm not cheating on anybody. I'm not sleeping around with anybody. Obviously it's not ideal. Looking at pornography is not ideal. And if you don't do it, don't start. But if you do it, you you know, it kind of, it's kind of whatever, you know, it's just, God understands. Especially in a world where it's very hard for men and women to meet each other, you know. The amount of single people in the United States is the highest it's ever been since the founding of this country. Other than maybe like, well, I don't know. I'd have to double check those statistics. Let me look it up real quick. Let me pause the video. All right. Whenever I said the percentage of single people is the highest it's ever been, and all throughout the history of the United States, I said that without any prior knowledge of it, but I just so happen to be right. So yeah, the percentage of single people, or the percentage of single Americans reached record high in recent years, with data including nearly half of adults, 46 to 49%, were single as of 2021 to 2022, a major rise from 28% in 1970. One-person households also reached a record 29% in 2022. While rising, some data suggests this trend might be leveling off as of late 2024, or whatever. Yeah. So it's very hard, you know, because people are becoming more antisocial, and people are also becoming more corrupt at the same time. So not only, you know, do people just want to be left alone because they're antisocial and they don't really want to be in a relationship, not only is there that aspect, or, you know, but people are more paranoid as well, especially women. Women are more paranoid, and also men are clueless and don't know how to talk to a woman without making her feel uncomfortable. There's that aspect. And then, what was I saying? Antisocial, and what was the other one? Let me pause it and think about it. I can't remember. People are corrupt, and also people are more corrupt than they were in the past, I believe. And also, there's not as many opportunities for people to meet. Like, there's not as many, you know, like, places where a man approaching a woman is considered appropriate. Like, for example, the gym. It's not considered appropriate. It's not considered the appropriate, you know, time or place for a man to approach a woman at the gym. And you know, a lot of women start recording men and saying, "Oh, he's disgusting. He's a pervert. He's making me feel uncomfortable at the gym." And then he gets kicked out of the gym. And you know, that's scary. And then, of course, there's and that kind of leans into the aspect of corruption. But not only is it hard to find somebody, but if you do finally find somebody, she's probably so disgustingly corrupt and narcissistic that she's not even worth being with. And the same could be said for a man. A man could be so disgustingly corrupt and narcissistic that he's not worth being with, you know. And so it's very hard. And God knows that better than anyone, you know. Because it's all part of Satan's plan to bring population decline. And God turns Satan's plan around into a positive and uses it as an opportunity for people to be single when they come into contact with the words of Almighty God. And as population control, as the spiritual realm is running out of souls to reincarnate, and we're reaching the end, the very, very end, because at the end of the Age of Kingdom, the people who perish will perish for all of eternity. And the people who survive will survive for all of eternity. And the people who survive will be a small number of people, and the people who perish will be a large number of people. So, there's a Bible verse that says, be fruitful and multiply. That's outdated. It's not needed in the current age because we're reaching the end. There's no point in, more people, because the majority of those people are going to perish for eternity anyways. So what's the point of them being born? So we don't need as many people as we used to. We needed as many people as possible, or God needed as many people as possible to save as many people as possible. And God is very fair. He takes responsibility for people, and it's not the case that just everybody's going to hell, or the majority of people are going to hell. We've talked about this. So, anyways, I've seen, God understands if you look at porn. He really does, because and it's not dispositional, it's instinctual. And God knows I've created, what are they called? Petitions. I've created petitions to make pornography illegal, And God knows if I had the choice, I wouldn't look at it. I mean, I feel terrible every time I look at it. And when I look at it, I just try to be finished with it as soon as possible. I just want it to be over with. I don't like doing it. It's not something I enjoy. It's not something I feel good about. It's not something I feel disgusting afterwards, and I feel ashamed. But it is what it is. I mean, God understands. I can't. No woman would be interested in me. Most women's standards don't include my situation. I'm on disability, and that's a big red flag and a turn off for women, because women want to be provided for by a man, and I wouldn't be able to provide for a woman. So I don't have a choice but to be single. And not only is the women that are available to me is narrowed. Like, if this is the pool of women in America, the ones that are available to me, it narrows it down to about this much. When you consider the fact I'm on disability, when you consider the fact I believe in Almighty God, it narrows it down to about that much. And and then it just gets smaller when you consider the fact I'm overweight. It gets smaller when you consider the fact I'm not like the most attractive looking guy in the world. It gets smaller when you consider that I don't have a vehicle. It gets smaller when you consider I think it gets smaller when you consider that I refuse to be with a woman that has no humanity and is like a narcissistic, super corrupt person. Like I will not be with somebody like that. So that narrows it down even more. So I have standards that most women can't reach, and women have standards that I can't reach. So we're just incompatible. I'm not really compatible with like 98% of women, you know, so that really narrows it down. Yeah, so I mean, I don't have a choice. You know, I have no control over the fact that I look at porn. I have no control over it because if I could get married, then I would be freed from these shackles. But because I can't get married, and I'm not using that as an excuse. Like I've prayed for years for God to bring me a wife, and He hasn't. Maybe because He hasn't been able to find anybody that's compatible with me, or anybody that could deal with my disability. You know, like I don't know. But you know, it the situation. I mean, it is what it is. You know, and I just have to submit to God's arrangements, and you know, this is what He's arranged, and you know, and so, anyways, um, I forgot what we were talking about. Um, all right, well, that's enough. Hopefully, you gained something from this video. I know it's not the best video, but anyways, thank you so much for watching. God bless and goodbye.